All
Hello,
right.
everybody.
Go ahead, Joseph.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Our next speaker is Jack Cable. Jack Cable is an American computer security researcher, software developer, and a student. He is best known for his participation in bug bounty programs, including placing first in the U.S. Department of Defense Hack the Air Force Challenge. And without further ado, I give you Jack Cable. Thank you.
Great, thank you for the intro. So we can go ahead and get started then. Welcome to my talk, the year of the vulnerability disclosure policy. Today, I'll be talking about what made 2020 such a great year for vulnerability disclosure policies, and as a result, a great year for hackers, what this means for the future of security research. Vulnerability disclosure policies are one of my favorite topics to talk about, so I hope this can help you see what's so great about them as well. Great. So to start, what is a vulnerability disclosure policy, also known as a VDP? A vulnerability disclosure policy is essentially a see something, say something for digital systems. It gives authorization to the public to test and report vulnerabilities in organizations' assets. So a VDP has four key parts, which I've listed out here. First, the VDP should clearly define the scope that's allowed for testing. Ideally, this is the organization's entire online presence, but it doesn't have to start out that way. An organization can start with just a few assets and slowly expand out as they get comfortable receiving reports and addressing them. Second, the VDP should authorize testing with what's called a legal safe harbor. This is a piece of legal language that states that the tester is authorized to test the organization's systems under relevant anti-hacking laws. The safe harbor commits that the organization will not bring legal claims against hackers for accidental good faith violations of the policy. This is probably one of the more important components of the VDP, and I'll dive in a little into what exactly you should be looking for in a safe harbor policy so that you can stay in scope and stay within the law as well. And I couldn't mention safe harbors without first mentioning the fantastic work of Amit Elzari and disclose.io. Amit's a lawyer and academic researcher who you should really be following, who popularized the idea of a safe harbor via her hashtag legal bug bounty project. I hope you saw her talk earlier today. And she also partnered with disclose.io, which I think many of you should know from Casey's talk, to introduce standardized language for safe harbors, VDPs, and bug bounties. So giant kudos to the work of Amit, Casey, and many others who made this happen. Third, a VDP should not restrict disclosure after a set time frame. We commonly see this with bug bounties. Some statement of the form do not disclose vulnerability without prior written permission or an NDA on the report themselves. And while this can be okay for a bug bounty, especially if the bug bounty is private, the crucial component of a VDP is that they should not restrict disclosure beyond a set time frame. This is usually, say, a 90-day window. This way, hackers have the ability to disclose the vulnerability once a set time frame has passed or once the vulnerability has been patched. And the reason that this is so important is because when a company has a VDP, they're essentially getting free work from hackers. So it's unreasonable for them to expect that hackers should do this work for free and not be able to talk about it afterwards. This allows VDPs to serve as a transparency role where organizations can better demonstrate their security to the public. And likewise, the public can then judge organizations based on their security posture, hopefully leading to better security for everyone. So lastly, a VDP should be open to the public. If it's a see something, say something policy, it doesn't make sense if only certain people can say something. Vulnerabilities are out there whether an organization likes it or not, and people will be looking for and finding these vulnerabilities. Restricting who can report to a VDP only has the role of restricting the people who already know about vulnerabilities from not being able to report them to the company. So whenever a company starts a VDP, it should be open to anyone in the world because vulnerabilities are out there and people are already aware of them, whether the company likes it or not. So going back to the idea of a safe harbor, which is, like I said, probably the most important component of the VDP, just because as we've seen with a lot of these talks today, security research can often run in with the law. So I'd say that when you're looking at a safe harbor policy, it sometimes looks like a wall of text. And that's because, of course, it's impossible to avoid some of the legalese. But here I've bolded kind of the two main parts that you should be looking for in a safe harbor. First, you should ask yourself, does the safe harbor authorize access to testing covered under the policy? So is it explicitly saying that your work in this program is authorized under relevant anti-hacking laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and the DMCA? So it should say that. And second, the policy should promise not to pursue legal action in response to activities in accordance with the program's policies. And ideally, it allows good faith accidental violations of the policy. So these two things combined, and I'm drawing here from the disclose.io terms, which you can see below, are what makes a safe harbor. So a program should really have both of these. We'll see that many programs do not, and this is something we can keep working to improve. But you should know that these are the gold standard for when it comes to vulnerability disclosure policy authorizing security research. You should look to make sure that it actually authorizes it under relevant laws, and then it commits not to take legal action for accidental good faith violations of policies. Okay, so next let's look at some common, say, complaints that people have about VDPs. And a common reaction I've seen in the community is that VDPs seem to be essentially just bug bounties without the cash reward. So a lot of hackers seem to look down upon companies for having a VDP when they could be paying bug bounties. Are they just trying to get people to work for them for free? So I want to make the point that VDPs and bug bounties are really complementary, and a bug bounty is not necessarily a replacement for a VDP. A VDP should be open to anyone, while bug bounty can be public or private. Further, like we've seen, a VDP should not restrict disclosure, while a bug bounty may. So unless an organization's bug bounty is doing both of these things, and that's completely public and doesn't restrict disclosure past a set time frame, the bug bounty is missing crucial aspects in a VDP. As a result, every organization needs to have a VDP. Every organization needs some channel where a member of the public can report a vulnerability that they've discovered in an authorized manner and is allowed to disclose it after a set time frame. A bug bounty is a bonus on top of that, but not every organization needs to have a bug bounty, especially if they're just starting out their security lifecycle. So the moral of the story really is don't fault a company for having a VDP. They're taking a proactive first step in improving their security with transparency, and this should be celebrated. If a company even has a VDP, they're in the minority of companies overall, and we can hope that this one day is all companies, but we should really celebrate any company that launches a VDP and engages with the security community to do better. So now on to some myths that I've seen on the organization side. And a lot of this I've seen, especially in government, where agencies are perhaps a little slower than normal to adopt the newest and standard trends in the security community. So one common refrain that organizations often have is that by opening the door up to hackers, it'll become impossible to distinguish between good faith and bad faith activity. They worry that essentially by opening up this door, as they see it, bad hackers will be able to get in as well. But by looking at vulnerability disclosure policies, we see that this just isn't true. And the reason for this is that a VDP clearly states what kind of activity is and is not allowed. If an adversary is exploiting a vulnerability and they say exfiltrate thousands of records on users, that's very clearly against the terms of the policy. So as a result, a program owner can tell if someone is or is not complying with the rules of the policy and still address malicious adversaries. A VDP only makes an organization safer because good faith actors will give them the ability to patch vulnerabilities before adversaries can exploit them. So what some agencies try to do in response to this is restrict their scope to say only vetted hackers. So maybe it's only hackers from certain countries, maybe it's only hackers that they've done a background check on. And while this can be okay for bug bounties where it's private and you're paying those people, this is problematic for VDP for reasons that I mentioned before, because restricting access to your VDP won't stop adversaries from exploiting your systems since they're already going to be going and doing it anyways. Instead, you're just restricting the ability of good hackers to help you out. So lastly, organizations sometimes think that they should wait to start a VDP, thinking that, hey, maybe we're not just ready for this. But I think that really it's never too early to start thinking about security. The reality is that people are already out there testing their systems and discovering vulnerabilities. At minimum, every organization needs to have a public channel for reporting vulnerabilities that people have already found. Organizations should invest the resources to start a VDP now so that they can get familiar with receiving and addressing these vulnerability reports. And again, adversaries are not waiting for a VDP to start testing, so we might as well let the good hackers help now. Okay, so now that we've established the baseline of what a VDP is, let's look at what happened in 2020. And it really was, in some ways, a viral year for vulnerability disclosure policies, no pun intended. At the start of 2020, according to disclose.io data, we had 880 known VDPs, 308 of those had full or partial safe harbors. Fast forward now to the end of 2020, we have 2,286 known VDPs, and 382 of those have full or partial safe harbors. So I think that the safe harbor number might be a little below just because we don't have the data on all of it. It probably should be higher. But in either case, the story that this tells is that organizations are rapidly adopting VDPs, almost tripling the amount of known VDPs in just 1 year. So this is very quickly becoming an industry standard. Organizations are becoming more proactive about their security. And as a result of engaging hackers, they're becoming more secure overall. So what led to this rise in VDPs? I want to look at two case studies in particular about VDP adoption. So the first one is that of the federal government, where CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, played a large role in requiring every federal agency to start a VDP. And the second case study is in the elections world, where both private companies and state governments launched vulnerability disclosure policies to improve the security of their election systems ahead of the 2020 election. So let's start with CISA. So if you're unfamiliar, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, aka CISA, is the primary federal entity responsible for coordinating the security of critical infrastructure in the United States. Full disclosure, I previously worked for CISA and think that you should too. It's a great place to work. As part of this, CISA has the ability to require federal, civilian, executive branch agencies to take certain actions to improve their security posture. And this process is known as a binding operational directive. So one directive in particular that's relevant here is the Binding Operational Directive 2001, which was published last year and requires federal agencies to establish a vulnerability disclosure policy. What's amazing about this is that with one signature, hundreds of federal agencies now are establishing VDPs. So what does this directive entail? Primarily, it requires that these federal, civilian, executive branch agencies establish a vulnerability disclosure policy within 6 months of the directive, which happened to be just a few weeks ago. It very much follows the requirements I talked about earlier in what makes a VDP, and that they clearly define scope, they authorize testing via a legal safe harbor, they don't restrict public disclosure after a set time frame, and they're open to the public. So the way that this directive is structured, organizations can start small by including just a few assets and over time expand to eventually include all of the organization's systems. So as a result of this directive, we see that now every, or at least in theory, every federal, civilian, executive branch agency should have a vulnerability disclosure policy. Of course, not all of them have complied just yet, but mostly all of them have. You can visit this link to see a list of all of them. And this is now hundreds of vulnerability disclosure policies out there. Basically every federal agency now, you can go and hack and report a vulnerability to them just because of one directive that CISA published. So this is really a huge, huge advancement, and massive kudos to everyone who made this happen. Shout out to Cameron Dixon at CISA. So go take a look at that list and hack on pretty much every federal government system you can think of, whether it's the IRS, CISA itself, the Department of Justice, Department of Treasury, anyone you can think of is on that list. You can find their VDP and they authorize testing. So that's a really great advancement. So the second case study I want to go into is with elections. And when you look at elections and their relationship with the security community, it's clear that historically this has been really, really strained. So we've seen this with several lawsuits over the years, and notably at the DEF CON voting village, where voting vendors and hackers have often squared off. So you have headlines like these highlighting how there's tensions flaring at the voting village. You have on one end vendors and states saying that DEF CON just isn't a realistic environment, that the equipment's out of date, and that hackers are just trying to draw attention to these theoretical vulnerabilities that just aren't exploitable in the real world. So it was hard for a lot of people to see a middle ground where hackers and election vendors could start working together. Because of course, the truth is somewhere in the middle. You can always do a better job in more accurately portraying the risks of these systems. But at the same time, we don't want to bury this. We want to be able to talk about it in the public, acknowledge that there's flaws in these systems and work with the vendors to get better. So this was just, I think, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And what's really remarkable is that if you fast forward to now, we really saw amazing improvement in how election vendors and hackers can interact. So 6 major voting vendors, some of them are listed here, together with the ISAC. And for those of you who like long acronyms, that's the Technology Information Sharing and Analysis Center. So it's essentially a group that brings together different industry organizations. So they got together here and started thinking about how they could better approach the hacker community. And I've served on an advisory council with the ISAC here to help advise these voting vendors about how to better interface with hackers. And one of the results that came out of this is that 4 vendors have since put out vulnerability disclosure policies, which by and large follow the guidelines that I set out earlier. So they authorize testing under relevant laws, they define their scope, one of the major areas is that they're open to the public. So a lot of the vendors say would ideally want to authorize who's testing these programs, but we saw before that policies really need to be open to the public. So I think that's a big win for the security community. And lastly, they don't restrict how you can disclose a vulnerability past a set time frame. So in addition to these voting vendors, several states entered the fray, with Ohio being the first to launch a vulnerability disclosure policy for their election systems, Iowa following shortly after. So all of these are really large advancements, the first time that hackers are being invited to hack election systems and work with both states and vendors to help make them better. So I think this is really tremendous. In just a few years, we go from having hackers and vendors not talking to each other at all to going to active collaboration where vendors, states are openly inviting hackers to poke around on their systems. So of course, there's still room to go. One of the big difficulties with voting equipment is that it can be difficult to get your hands on if you're a hacker. So I'd love to see a model where vendors go beyond their policies right now, most of which just cover digital assets, and proactively give hackers access to the latest equipment to test in some form like the voting village. Okay, so recognizing time, I want to talk a little bit about when VDPs don't go exactly as well as we would have liked. So I want to talk a little bit about votes, because this is an important case study for how security research can be treated wrongly. And I want to emphasize that this is very much the exception rather than the rule, and that the vast majority of VDPs and bug bounties are productive. But with the case of Votes, who's an online voting vendor, we saw them resorting to tactics of voting vendors from, say, a decade ago, even though they had an active bug bounty which had a safe harbor. What happened is that a University of Michigan student was looking at the bug bounty program, and Votes ended up reporting that student for whatever reason to the state of West Virginia, who in turn reported the student to the FBI. And it's unlikely that anything really came out of this, but still likely caused a tremendous amount of unnecessary emotional and financial costs to the student. Votes' reasoning was that the student was testing a live system instead of the test system that they'd established. But the kicker here is that Votes changed their safe harbor after the fact to make the student's actions look out of scope. And again, I want to emphasize, across thousands of VDPs and bug bounties, Votes is only one of a handful of cases where it's turned this poorly. But this just goes to show that there are some bad actors out there who want to frame security research as a bad thing. So we need to have some caution as a security community to make sure that these actors aren't allowed to prey on security researchers. And when it does happen, we stand up for them. So one of the things that came out of this was that Votes filed a brief to the Supreme Court in the case Van Buren versus the United States, which Harley talked about earlier. If you missed that talk, the case is essentially looking into whether a terms of service violation should be a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So Votes' argument was that it should be, because how else would they be able to report good faith hackers to the law if they didn't have more flexibility? And of course, Votes is standing on the wrong side of history here. We ended up writing with disclose.io a response letter to votes, which ended up with over 50 signatures, including the Congressman Jim Langevin of Rhode Island, was featured in Bo's talk. And in the letter, we refuted Votes' points, argued that security research was vital to security to the public interest, and that the scope of CFAA must be narrowed to better protect security researchers. And I bring this up to show that Votes is indeed an outlier, but the security community is on the side of hackers here. And you really have to speak up if vendor acts like Vote does, attempting to go after good faith security research. So someone said that every talk has to feature one of these memes with the Ever Given ship. So here's mine. So you have Votes on one end trying to push back against productive reform to anti-hacking legislation and rising adoptions of VDPs, but ultimately they don't have much power if the security community unites and stands up to them. Okay, so what does all of this mean? So first, we're seeing a huge increase in VDPs, and I think that this is really great for overall security. We're seeing that companies are increasingly willing to be more transparent with their security, and it would really be a mistake if we didn't capitalize on this to really take advantage of the fact that we can now differentiate organizations based on their security. So if an organization doesn't have a VDP at all, then they're actively negligent in addressing their security. A company that does have a VDP and is open to external feedback is much better in my mind, and I would much more happily use their products. So a core part of these beliefs is that a VDP and the public response, it's not so much what is found, but how a company responds to it. So everyone has vulnerabilities, and the first step to getting rid of them is acknowledging that they're there. So what matters is how the organization responds to it. And we need to start using VDPs as a forcing function here to shine a light on companies' security and how they're responding to security reports so that we can urge them to do better. Lastly, some recommendations. So if you're an organization, go ahead and start a VDP. There's really nothing to lose by getting free insight to improve the security of your organization. And if you're a hacker, don't be afraid to go out and reach out to an organization to help them to start a VDP. I've done this a number of times, for instance, with some of the election vendors, and it's led to really great outcomes. They want to know how to make things work. Disclose.io is a great place to point to for a model of how to do this correctly. And lastly, organizations should start small, perhaps with just a few assets to get familiar with handling vulnerability reports and build your way up as you get more familiar. Okay, and then for the hackers, go ahead and hack on VDPs. Disclose.io has a fantastic search feature to look through all of the existing VDPs. I'm sure you can find that, say, a small company or government agency would really value your help. So VDPs are just the first step in improving an organization's security posture, and we as a community can help organizations to do better. So with that, I'm happy to take questions here or in Discord if you have them. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jack. And we're taking the questions offline in Discord just because of the logistics. We actually are streaming pretty much everywhere right now. So for those of you that are listening in, and of course, the Discord information is in the bottom of the screen, as always. And once again, thank you so much, Jack, for supporting the event and for supporting the community. Amazing presentation.
Thank you all.
Thank you. We're going to go in a quick break until we get set for the next presentation. So we'll be right back.